I'm Diane Brigant, a sister of St. Agnes from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, and I am Distinguished Professor of Old Testament Studies at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. I'd like to share with you some biblical reflections on a couple of themes that we find explained, expanded in the Holy Father's document Laudato Si, which speaks about ecology. The phrase that he uses is integral ecology, speaking about the integration of, or the interconnectedness of all of the natural world. There are three topics particularly that I'm interested in from a biblical point of view. One of them is anthropocentrism. Not just anthropocentrism. I want to put an adjective in front of that because everything we do is anthropocentric. The Holy Father speaks against or criticizes what he calls radical anthropocentrism, extreme anthropocentrism, misguided anthropocentrism, all negative adjectives, meaning a kind of understanding of human accomplishment and ability, human values that would suggest the only thing that is really significant is what is human, and that is the guide for judging the value of everything else. Frequently people speak today about intrinsic value or instrumental value. Intrinsic value means everything in the natural world has value in itself. The other instrumental value is extreme anthropocentrism, which would suggest it only has value as an instrument for our interests and our concerns. An example of extreme anthropocentrism, several years ago something happened in Chicago which was probably not unique, but it caught my attention. This was Chicago in the winter, and the temperature was 56 degrees below zero wind chill value. Now the 56 degrees below. The story is about a man who went out to start his car and it didn't start. But it's 56 degrees below zero. So he was so frustrated that the car didn't start that he went to his house, got his revolver, and shot the radiator twice. What's the value in this? What's the lesson in this? What's the insight in this? First of all, I think there's no value. The lesson is what we learned. I don't know if he learned it. But the insight is the natural world, which in this case would be weather, should really not inconvenience us. And I invite you to answer this question. Think about it first and then answer it to yourself. What's good weather? I think good weather is weather that does not inconvenience us. Is rain good weather? Well, it depends. If we need the rain, which I understand California needs the rain, the Midwest needs the rain, everybody needs the rain. If we need the rain, then rain is good. But if we have a picnic, then the rain is bad. So good weather, in the thinking of many people, is weather that does not inconvenience us. In the winter, why do we get angry if it's snowing and the traffic is slow? If the bus is late, or if we're spinning in the snow, why do we get angry? What do we expect the weather to do? Now, nobody would say this, but I think many, if not all of us, act it out. Weather should never inconvenience us. That is an example of radical anthropocentrism. Now, the Holy Father then speaks against radical anthropocentrism. I want us to look at anthropocentrism with an adjective, limited anthropocentrism. Because to think that we are limited human beings, it's easy to say, it's easy to admit, but we act as if we're not limited. We act as if we want to be in charge of everything. So that's what the Holy Father has to say, or at least expands when he talks about radical anthropocentrism. The second theme is interconnectedness, and that's what I want to talk about now. And the third one is interdependence, which I'll look at another time. Interconnectedness. Now, we know we are interconnected with each other physically. And evidence of that is we can live off of each other's blood. Not everybody's, but we can live off of each other's blood. We can live off of each other's organs. So physically, we are connected with each other. But also, physically, we're connected with animals. We eat them. And we can turn animal into ourselves. There's a natural physical connection. We are connected physically with plants because we can eat them. We are connected physically with air because we breathe it in. We are connected physically with the sun because we enjoy its warmth. Physical connection. We are connected with a cool breeze in the summertime because it cools us off. We are connected to the earth that heats us. We are connected to the earth that cools us. And we are connected with the earth that feeds us. So physically, there is an interconnectedness. Also, we are connected emotionally with each other. We're connected emotionally with animals. People leave money, to dogs. People have pets. So we are connected emotionally. We're connected emotionally with where we live. We're connected if we live near water. There's a connection, an emotional connection. We don't think enough about our interconnectedness. We're not simply connected physically with our parents or their siblings or with our extended family. We are all part of our extended family. So, when he talks about interconnectedness, he's talking about this. I want us to look or think for a moment at a biblical passage, the Genesis 2 creation narrative. And it is very clear in the Genesis 2 creation narrative that the ancients knew that they were connected. And they weren't the only ones. Read Chief Seattle's writes sometimes. He says some beautiful things, beautiful things. He talks about the earth, he talks about the air, he talks about the water, and how interconnected. Many of us in the past thought that was paganism, or at least primitivism. It is interesting how all of a sudden we are recognizing that it is profound ecology, which is a religious understanding, not simply a scientific, a religious understanding as well. So we look at Genesis 2, the creation narrative. Now, we've got to always remember that in all societies, in all cultures, they have stories about their origin. And their origin really is where they come from, not simply how, but where. One of my favorite, other than biblical, creation stories is from the Plains Indians. And all of the details of the story come from their experience of life. Very briefly, the story is that 2 corn cobs were laid down together on the ground. Well, corn cobs, the Plains Indians are very concerned about corn cobs. That's part of their existence, their survival. So their survival is connected with their origin. So the 2 corn cobs are placed down and covered with a blanket. Plains Indians. And then the Great Spirit comes sweeping through the plains. The plains. All of these details come from their experience. And blows off the blanket. And now you have a man and a woman. The corn cobs have been transformed by the Great Spirit of the plains into a man and a woman. And traces of the Great Spirit are found on the tips of their fingers. I think that's a beautiful story about interconnectedness and origin of where they come from. There's another story about interconnectedness that is from the Eskimo, one of the Eskimo tribes. I can't remember which one, but one of the Eskimo tribes. It's a tribe that is dependent, totally dependent on the seal. And it shows, once again, that their experience is a recognition that they are part of their origin. And the story has to do with going to the hunt. And before they go to the hunt, they pray to the spirit of the seal, asking if one of the seals would be willing to give up itself so that the Eskimos themselves, so that the tribe can survive. So it's a religious experience. Pray to the seal. And they go out and they catch the seal. But the way they catch the seal is with great respect for the animal, and the way they do it is not a violation, at least the way they understand violation. So they bring the seal back to the village, and every part of the seal is used. Nothing is wasted, because to waste is to insult, is to disdain, it is to lack respect. And they do that knowing that if they don't, next year there'll be nobody, no seal will be willing to sacrifice itself so the village can survive. Again, speaking about interconnectedness, it also speaks about interdependence, but those two words are connected as well. So we go back to the Genesis 2 creation narrative, a story we all know, or many of us know, that the man, Adam is the Hebrew word, comes from the ground, and the Hebrew word for ground is Adamah. Now we must remember that most of the stories, particularly in the Old Testament, but the New Testament as well, were originally oral stories, that people would sit together and tell stories like we still do when we have family gatherings. Or you go to a class reunion, what do? You tell stories. And the stories are not always the same. You don't even tell them the same way, because that's what happens in orality. We tell stories. So then the people then tell stories about the origin. And now telling a story, in an oral culture, you hear things. There are traces in the Bible that indicate clearly that these stories came from an oral culture, because you hear things, you hear repetition. Evening, morning, first day, evening, morning, second day, evening, morning, third day. You hear it. Also, and God saw that was good, and God saw that was good. So you hear repetition. That's one of the clues that the story came from an oral culture. Another clue is that you hear rhythm and rhyme. So you hear rhyme as well. Now in Hebrew, Adam comes from Adamah. You hear it. You may think that the word itself comes from the other word, Adamah. But certainly in the story, Adam comes from Adamah, is made of the same stuff. That's interconnectedness. They recognized it. I don't want to give the ancients more credit than they deserve for being scientifically astute. But again, traditional people recognize things that we have forgotten, because we are at least 1 or 2 steps away, from grassroots. They aren't. They are the grassroots. So they are very much aware of their interdependence. When you go to get some meat, and you don't, what you find is something wrapped up in plastic, then in a plastic bag. It's an entirely different experience than if you have to go and choose what you're going to kill. So you slaughter it, and you slaughter it well. You slaughter it so nothing is lost. You preserve it yourself, and then you cook it. You're right there at grassroots. So that's very much a part of a more traditional society.
I have a very dear friend. His name is Father Marty Padovani. Father Marty is a counselor. For many years, he's been able to work with individuals, but also with couples. And he's written a book, Healing Wounded Relationships, that is kind of the wealth of his deep insights through many years into how to make relationships work. I know that you and I can relate very well to those relationships which have been wounded, which are sometimes even bleeding. Listen to some of the topics that he has in here. Just simple things on communication, listening, intimacy, forgiveness, reconciliation, dealing with anxiety and fear, and a very practical question: how do you make a marriage work? I know you are going to be enriched. I want to send it to you. I want you to be able to be blessed by this book, and I know you will be. For your donation of $15, pick up the phone right now. You see the number. Listen, this, I really believe, can change your life.
So the man, Adam, comes from Adamah. But if you read carefully, that was Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. But in Genesis, same chapter, same story, it says that, further down in verse 9, just 2 verses later, that the trees come from Adamah. So now you've got the man comes from Adamah, the ground, and the trees come from Adamah, the ground. So there must be a connection between the man and the trees. Again, something that a more traditional society is very aware of, which many of us who live in the cosmopolitan centers are not. Where do you go to get grapes? You don't go to the field, you go to the supermarket, right? But people who raise the grapes, they know where the grapes come from. So again, it's a cultural reality. So the man comes from Adamah, the tree comes from Adamah, chapter 2, verse 9, chapter 2, verse 19, so do the wild beasts. They come from Adamah. So what you have is a recognition that the stuff of earth comes from earth, just like the man does, comes from earth. You can't talk about Genesis 2 creation without talking about the creation of the woman. Much of what we think we know about that story does not come from the text. It comes from our interpretation of the text. So what I'm going to give now is what is probably a very common interpretation of the creation of the woman. So it says, and I say this, some with tongue-in-cheek, which is also not tongue-in-cheek. Because you see, in our society frequently, we don't make fun of the male, but we make fun of the female. Particularly a woman should not make fun of the male. But I'm not making fun. The text says this. The text says, it is not good for the man to be alone. I will make for him a suitable partner. And so what did he make? The wild beasts. Right? Now, what God is saying there is not that men are wild beasts. What God is saying there is, number one, it's not good for the man to be alone. The Hebrew word for alone means separated against himself. It's awkward in English, but it's not simply solitary. It means separated against himself, which means he's incomplete. And so what happens? Then God creates the wild beasts. Not because God thinks that man will be complete with the wild beasts, but God creates the wild beasts. Remember, this is a creative or a very mythological story. The text goes on and say, but it was not enough. And the Hebrew that we translate suitable partner, the Hebrew is etzer. And if you do a word study in the Hebrew about that word, you discover almost always, with few exceptions, the etzer is always God. So it's not suitable partner, it's something bigger than that. And frequently is God, who is the source of blessing. Again, you don't get that in translation. Source of blessing. So the animals are not etzer. They are not a source of blessing in the same way as the man needs a source of blessing. So then God makes the woman. The Hebrew word for woman is isha. And then he brings them to the man. And what does the man say? She at last is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, and now I am complete. She comes from me, but she's separate from. Now I am complete. What does that story mean? Where does that story come from? There is an ancient Mesopotamian story of creation, the creation of a woman. And that story, again, is appropriated into the ancient Israelite tradition. So it's carried over, but it's translated into Hebrew. And that's important to remember because you've got the story, but you don't hear it in your ear like you hear Adam comes from Adamah, because it's a different language. So the story or the connection which you hear in ancient Sumerian is that the woman of the rib is the woman of life, because in ancient Sumerian, in one dialect, rib and life, you would hear the connection, or at least it would sound very much the same. So that's probably where this comes from. There's another tradition, ancient Sumerian, that maybe the first creature was undifferentiated sexually until they were separated by the woman coming from the man. So the first creature undifferentiated then became man and woman. One can decide. There is a feminist interpreter, Phyllis Tribble, who has done a literary analysis of image of God and also separation here. She also believes, from a literary analysis, that it was sexually undifferentiated. Either that, or what you had is a hermaphrodite, where you had somebody who had characteristics of both men and women. The point that I want to make is not the physical, whether it was sexual physically, but the issue is that there's a connection between the woman of life and the woman of the rib, which you don't hear in translation in Hebrew. Now, we know the woman of life, well, we know her as a woman of rib, first of all, but later on in the story, Adam says she will be called Eve because she is the mother of the living. So there you have the woman of life. So maybe that's what the ancients interpreted the ancient Sumerian. Now, many people think that the woman is inferior to the man because she comes from his rib. She is secondary, and she comes from him. That makes her inferior. That's a biased interpretation, because if you use that interpretation, how then do you interpret the creation of the man? He comes from dirt. He comes from the ground. Does that make him inferior because he comes from the ground? She comes from the rib of a man. So you see, when we think that that creation narrative justifies a bias against women, we are reading our bias into the story. Story has nothing to do with that. What does the story have to do with it? With interconnectedness? First of all, the origin. The man is connected with earth, and you hear it in the Hebrew. Again, the question is not that it really happened that way. The question is, what does the story mean? So he is connected with the earth, and she is connected with him. So there is an interconnectedness. Also, many of us think when we go to Genesis 3, the story of the fall and the punishment, we understand that in terms of original sin. But read the story carefully. The man comes from the earth. How is he punished? In terms of his relationship with the earth. Because it says that you will find it extremely difficult to farm. You will find thistles and thorns. So his relationship, it's original from his origin. It does not mean there's a black spot on him now. From his origin. And she, in her creation, is connected with the man. And how does she suffer? In her relationship with the man. She will suffer in terms of childbirth, which is her relationship with the man. And besides that, her longing will still be for him, because intercourse, or at least the consequences of intercourse, birth, is so painful. One would think she'd stay away from him, but there's still a yearning. There still is this connection. So again, the issues all have to do with connectedness, interconnectedness. As I said, we know we are connected physically with each other. We are also connected emotionally. So it's not just material. We are connected emotionally with other people, with other creatures, with our pets. We are connected emotionally frequently with our place of birth. Or we are connected emotionally with where we live because of the beauty of nature. So it's interconnectedness. That has a very, very profound understanding ecologically. We are connected with the whole natural world. There is an Australian theologian by the name of Dennis Edwards, who has a tiny little book with a magnificent title, which sounds very poetic, but it's also very scientific. And the title of the book is Made from Stardust. Now, that's beautiful, but that's profound scientifically. We are made from stardust. We are what Earth produces. And Earth comes from the great Big Bang, which means that everything in our universe, or in the multiverse, they don't even talk about universe anymore, they talk about multiverses. Everything comes from the same stuff. Now that's scientific. Another, not as poetic way of saying is, every one of us is made out of cosmic junk, recycled cosmic junk. After the Big Bang, and everything is expanding, we are what Earth produces in a certain way. And cosmologists work it all out in terms of made of the same stuff, interconnected with the universe, physically, but also emotionally. Otherwise, why do people go out and look at stars at night? What is it in us that makes us want to look at the moon? Why don't we just, okay, I've seen it, I don't have to do it again. No, we'll do it all the time. We will travel the world to see an eclipse. Why is it? What attracts us? We're wired for this. Or a sunset. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, in the little book, The Little Prince. The little prince is sitting on a chair and watches sunset after sun. He just moves his chair a little bit and watches another sunset and another sunset. Why do we do that? Why do we look into the eyes of people we love and gaze into the eyes of people we love and not want to stop? What is it within us? It's all part of an interconnectedness. It's a physical interconnectedness. It's also an emotional interconnectedness. And I want to add to that, it's a spiritual reality. It's a spiritual. I mean, you have spiritual experiences when, at retreat time, whether it's a day or a week, when we're given pictures of nature. We're connected with it. We're part of it. And it's part of us. That's the beauty of who we are as part of this world.